Welcome to our deep dive into the forces that are shaping global power. All those things that kind of make you wonder where the world is heading.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we're looking at this report
Oh, right.
from the Institute for Economics and Peace. It's called Geopolitical Influence and Peace. And, these reports can be a little dense sometimes,
Uh-huh.
but I think you'll agree it's packed with insights that really make you stop and think.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
We'll break it all down for you here. You'll get a clear picture of just where things stand today,
Right.
everything from geopolitical risks to that record military spending we've been seeing and how the UN is changing, and of course all those new players on the global stage.
And the thing that really caught my eye was how all this impacts the developing world.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking proxy wars and debt burdens and just the growing influence of countries like China.
Yeah, it paints a pretty intense picture for sure, but by the end of this deep dive, I think you'll really understand the forces at play and what they mean for the future of, peace and security globally.
Okay, so let's dive right in. I guess the report starts off with a bit of a gut punch, you could say.
Yeah.
It claims that the geopolitical risk that we're facing today is higher than it was during the Cold War.
Wow.
In fact, it's approaching the levels we saw after 9/11.
Really?
It makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a wake-up call. The report uses this thing called the Geopolitical Risk Index, which basically just tracks any kind of conflict-related news you see out there.
Uh,
And that index is showing a world that's becoming, increasingly unpredictable.
yeah.
And one of the big drivers of this risk is military spending.
Oh, yeah.
It just hit a record high in 2023, over $2.4 trillion.
That's a lot.
Yeah, a lot of it fueled by things like the war in Ukraine.
Right, of course, and that's such a huge factor in everything right now. But the report also argues that while there are some obvious similarities to the Cold War, right on the surface, the world today is very different in some really key ways. Trade, for example. Back then you had these isolated blocks, but now everything's so interconnected, we trade way more than we used to. What do you think about that?
Well, the report makes a point of saying that global trade growth has actually kind of plateaued over the last 10 years. It's hovering at around 60% of global GDP.
Interesting.
Yeah, and that has a lot of implications. It could mean that we won't see the same rapid expansion of trade that we've gotten used to,
That's a good point.
which could affect, everything from the price of things we buy every day to job markets.
Yeah, when you think about it, it really does touch everything.
Yeah.
And speaking of institutions that impact our lives,
Right.
what about the UN? I mean, that was supposed to be the go-to for solving global problems, right? What's the report say about them?
Well, it shows a pretty big decrease in Security Council resolutions. Plus, there's been this sharp rise in vetoes coming from Russia and China, especially.
Wow, so the UN's not the powerhouse it used to be.
It seems that way. The days of the UN being, this big force for peace might be over.
That's pretty disheartening, isn't it? We seem to be losing all these mechanisms for, global cooperation at a time when we probably need them the most.
Yeah.
What about the whole push for nuclear disarmament? I remember that being a really big topic a while back.
Right.
Any progress there?
Well, sadly, the report highlights how progress on nuclear disarmament has stalled completely. And to make matters worse, some countries are actually increasing their nuclear arsenals.
That's scary. Haven't we learned our lesson about nuclear weapons?
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
But the reality is that the risks are increasing. We haven't really made much progress in reducing nuclear stockpiles and the potential for, more countries to develop these weapons. It's like a recipe for disaster.
A wake-up call for sure. And the report talks about all these new players coming in. It's not just the traditional powerhouses anymore, right?
Exactly. There are countries like Turkey, the UAE, Vietnam, and Indonesia.
Oh, wow.
They're all gaining influence and kind of shaking things up.
Okay, so to recap, we've got rising geopolitical risks, changes in trade, the UN's losing power, and the threat of nuclear war. On top of all that, we've got these new players trying to, make their mark. It's a lot to take in.
It is, but stick with us because this is where it gets interesting. All of these global shifts are having a huge impact on the developing world. And that's what we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, I'm ready for more.
Right.
So last time we were talking about all these global shifts, like all the rising risks and how trade is changing and the UN's kind of fading away and how it's all creating this whole new power dynamic.
Right.
You mentioned that these shifts are having a pretty big impact on the developing world.
Yeah.
Can you break that down a bit more for me? Like, what's that actually look like, on the ground?
Well, think of it as kind of like a new great game. Powerful countries are all competing for control over regions like Africa, South Asia, and South America.
Hmm.
They're all competing for resources, for political allies, for anything that can give them an edge in these really strategically important areas.
So it's like a giant game of chess with the developing world as the chessboard.
Exactly. And one of the biggest pieces on that board is China. Remember we talked about their growing influence?
Yeah, yeah.
A good example of how they're strategically, expanding their reach is the Belt and Road Initiative.
Oh, yeah, the BRI. That's been in the news a lot lately.
Yeah.
But isn't that just about building infrastructure?
Hmm.
Like roads and bridges and things like that?
It's actually a lot more than that.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure, there are infrastructure projects, but it also involves loans and trade deals and all sorts of other, economic ties.
Yeah.
It's really all designed to kind of create this network of dependencies, both economic and political.
So it's not just about building roads, it's about building leverage.
Exactly. And it's working. We saw in the data that China's influence in places like West Africa has just skyrocketed.
Wow.
They've become the dominant external force in a lot of developing countries, often surpassing, the traditional Western powers.
That's pretty major.
Huh.
So China's playing the long game here.
Oh, absolutely. They're thinking decades ahead,
Yeah.
strategically positioning themselves for global leadership. But it's not just China that's making moves. Other countries are stepping up their game, too.
Like who?
Well, look at the Middle East, for example. Countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia are using their oil wealth to forge new alliances, build military bases, and really exert their influence across the whole region.
So it's a multiplayer game now. Everyone's trying to get a piece of the pie.
Yeah.
But how does all this competition actually turn into, conflict? I mean, we're not talking about like outright wars between superpowers, are we?
Not yet, at least. But we are seeing a rise in these proxy wars, where major powers back different sides in regional conflicts.
Right.
They kind of fuel the violence and the instability,
You mentioned Sudan last time.
Yeah.
Is that a good example of what we're talking about?
Absolutely. Sudan's a textbook example of how competition for influence can lead to really devastating consequences.
Right.
You've got various external powers backing different groups in the conflict, each with their own agenda, and the result is a humanitarian catastrophe.
It's just awful to think about all the people caught in the middle of that.
It is, and it's not just Sudan. We're seeing similar dynamics play out in other conflict zones around the world.
Yeah, like where?
Well, think about the Sahel region of Africa. It's become a hotbed of instability with poverty and climate change and weak governance. It's a breeding ground for all kinds of extremist groups. And external powers are, flocking to the region because they want to secure their own interests.
It sounds like a very complex and dangerous situation. It's hard to see how things will get better.
It's a tough situation for sure. The report even compares what's happening today to the proxy wars of the Cold War, which, as we all know, had terrible consequences. And one really disturbing trend is the rise of mass atrocities. Remember, we talked about the UN estimates of up to 15,000 people killed in those RSF massacres in Sudan?
Yeah, that was horrifying to hear. It's a reminder that this isn't just some, abstract geopolitical game. Real people are suffering because of these power struggles.
You're absolutely right. And unfortunately, it's often the people who have the least power that end up paying the highest price. But it's not just about conflict either. There's a huge economic dimension to this new great game. Remember we talked about how developing countries are facing these massive debt burdens?
Right, that was a pretty alarming statistic.
Yeah.
Like something about billions of people living in countries where their debt interest payments were more than they were spending on things like health and education.
Exactly.
It's hard to even imagine.
Right.
How does that tie into this whole, competition for influence?
Well, developing countries often need loans, right? To finance infrastructure, to stimulate their economies, to provide basic services. And who's there to offer those loans? Often it's countries like China that are looking to expand their own influence.
So these countries are basically getting trapped in a cycle of debt.
Exactly. And that debt can be used as leverage. The lender can demand access to natural resources. They can demand political support or even just a blind eye to human rights abuses. When a country can't repay its loans, it becomes vulnerable to its creditors.
So these loans aren't just about helping developing countries, they're about gaining control. That's kind of scary when you think about it.
It's a complex situation. There are definitely cases where these loans can be beneficial, but all too often they come with strings attached. And that's something developing countries need to be very careful about.
So we've got this mix of political and economic maneuvering all happening in the developing world. It sounds like these countries are caught in a really tough spot. Is there any way for them to break free from this cycle of competition and debt?
Well, it's not easy, but there are some strategies they can use. One is diversification. Instead of relying on just one or two major powers, they can build relationships with a wider range of partners.
So playing one power off against the other, kind of like a game of their own.
In a way, yeah. It's about creating a balance of power, making sure they have options and aren't forced to make concessions that hurt them in the long run.
What other strategies can they use?
Another important one is regional cooperation. By working together, developing countries can have a stronger voice on the global stage and create a more level playing field.
Right.
We've seen the power of regional groups like the African Union in standing up for their members, their strength in numbers, and by combining resources and expertise, they can tackle shared challenges more effectively.
That makes sense. So it's not just about reacting to what the major powers are doing, it's about being proactive and setting their own agenda. But with all these challenges they're facing, is it even possible for developing countries to really take control of their own futures?
It's a tough road ahead for sure. But the report does offer a glimmer of hope. It suggests that developing countries can navigate this complex geopolitical landscape and come out stronger if they play their cards, right? And that's where you come in. Understanding these dynamics, recognizing the forces at play, is the first step towards making informed choices and supporting policies that promote a more equitable and peaceful world. And that's what we'll talk about in part 3.
So we've talked about all these geopolitical power shifts and how it all plays out in the developing world.
Right.
It's a lot to think about.
It is.
I mean, it sometimes feels like these countries are just caught in the middle with not a lot they can do.
It's easy to feel that way. But remember, the report highlights that developing countries aren't, powerless in this situation. They have agency.
Right.
There are steps they can take to shape their own destinies. But it's not just about them.
Yeah.
We all have a role to play in creating a more just and peaceful world.
Okay, that brings up a question I've had this whole time. Like, what can we do about any of this? I get that we need to understand these, global forces, but how can we as individuals make a difference?
Well, I think the first step is recognizing that our actions, even small ones, can have a ripple effect.
So it's not just about, donating to charities or volunteering.
Yeah.
Those things are important, but you're saying there's more to it.
Right. It's about being informed and engaged citizens. Remember we talked about the UN and how it's not as effective as it used to be?
Yeah.
Part of that is because there isn't enough public pressure on governments to, prioritize global cooperation and diplomacy.
So it's on us to hold our leaders accountable.
Exactly. We need to demand that our governments invest in diplomacy and conflict prevention in those international institutions that can help level the playing field.
Okay, I get that.
Yeah.
But how do we actually do that? I mean, I'm just one person. What can I really do to influence government policy?
Well, there are a lot of things you can do. You can write to your representatives, you can speak out on social media, get involved with organizations working on these issues. There's power in numbers, and when people raise their voices together, it can make a difference.
So that's the political side. But what about the economic side? We were talking about those debt burdens that developing countries are dealing with a lot of times, fueled by, those predatory lending practices. Is there anything we could do about that?
Absolutely. It comes down to conscious consumerism. We can choose to support businesses that operate ethically, that prioritize fair trade, that invest in sustainable development. And we can avoid companies that, exploit workers or damage the environment or contribute to conflict.
So every time we buy something, we're making a choice.
Exactly. Every purchase is a vote for the kind of world we want to live in.
It's kind of empowering when you put it that way, but it also feels like a lot of pressure.
It is, but it's also an opportunity. We have the power to shape the future, not just for ourselves, but for people all over the world. And that brings us to another important point, education.
Right, we talked about that, learning about different cultures and perspectives.
Exactly.
But how does that actually help? Is it really enough to just be informed?
It is, because the more we understand about the world, the better we are at, challenging stereotypes, breaking down barriers, and building bridges instead of walls. Remember, the report emphasized that we need global solidarity. We need to remember that we're all connected.
It's easy to forget that sometimes,
Yeah.
especially with all the, negativity and division we see.
It is. But it's important to remember that we're all part of the same human family. We share this planet, and we all have a responsibility to care for each other and for the world we live in.
I like that. It's like, even with all these challenges, there's still hope.
Absolutely. And it starts with each one of us, making informed choices, speaking out for what we believe in, taking action in our communities and beyond.
This whole deep dive has really made me realize how much power we have.
Yeah.
It's not just about these big global forces out there.
Right.
It's about the choices we make every day.
Exactly. So let's not underestimate the power of our actions. Let's choose to be a force for good in the world. Let's work together to create a future where everyone has a chance to thrive.
And that's a wrap on our deep dive into, global power and how it impacts the developing world. It's been a heavy but really important conversation.
It has.
So remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about these complex issues, the more we can do to make a difference.
Right.
So keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep engaging with these issues, and most importantly, keep taking action. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you later.